Welcome to this Introduction to Textiles video. In this video we're going to be going through how to sew a open seam stitch sampler that looks like this. In this video we're going to be going through how to measure and mark out a seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters. We're going to learn how to pin correctly, we're going to learn how to tack and sew your seam allowance on the sewing machine before you press and overlock your seam open. So the first thing that we need to do is measure and mark a seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters from the edge. But before we do that, we need to cut our fabric, fold our fabric and cut it in half. So we just press a fold in with our hands. Remember to use the scissors nice and flat, nice big snips. There we have that. The next part is measuring our seam allowance. So we need our measuring tape and we need our chalk, and we measure 1.5 centimeters from the edge. So remember, we don't want to use inches, we want to use centimeters. 1.5, so we're just going to measure several measurements along that edge. Having a ruler handy will enable you to get a nice straight line along that edge. Our next step is to get our pins and pin along that line. When we pin, we want to remember to have our pins top to tail. So if you are sewing straight on the machine with the pins in, it's a lot easier to remove them with your right hand as you're sewing. Also make sure that your edges are lined up. And also be careful of your fingers. The next step is to thread up a needle. So I'll just get a big one because it's easy to thread. I'll get my colourful thread, just using blue, and I want to have it long enough to be able to cover a length that will cover your piece of fabric. So, tips when threading up your needle is helps to lick your thread. But if you've got skills like me, you don't need to worry about it. So there we have our needle and thread. We're just going to match the ends together. So I've folded the thread in half. Just going to match the edges of the thread. Tie 2 or 3 knots. So that knot is as chunky as possible and won't slip through your fabric. And then we want to start hand sewing or tacking from the bottom of the fabric all the way to the top. So we take our pins out as we go. We might turn it over this way to make it a little bit easier. So it's just like the motion of pinning. Take your pins out as you go, in and out, about 1 centimeter for each the further apart it is, it doesn't hold as well. And you want to keep your needle along the line, and you also want to make sure that your edges of your fabric is still together, nice and even. So I just want to tie that off at the end as well. So I just want to make a bit of a loop. Hold that as close down as you can, and that'll be fine. This is just a temporary stitch, just to keep your fabric together so you can sew over the thread and not over pins. So once we have done our preparation, we are ready to sew our seam allowance on the sewing machine. So just because we have a temporary tacking stitch on our fabric, we can sew directly over the top of it without it wrecking the sewing machine. So remember, we start at the top of the fabric and we line up, always line up your fabric with that second line on the sewing machine there. And we are ready to sew. So on this we are sewing a back stitch, and our settings for this is a straight stitch of 0, 2.5 to 3. So we go forwards a few stitches, we go backwards a few stitches by holding up the stitch length knob and reverse. We go forward all the way to the end. And we are happily sewing over our tacking stitch. We're going to reverse at the end and forward at the end. So once that's done, we cut the threads. And this is what you should see at this step. Your tacking stitch, your measurement of your seam allowance, and your straight stitch on the machine. So our next step is to iron our fabric so it's nice and neat and flat. And then what we want to do is open out our fabric and open out the seam like this and press a fold into the seam. Alright, this machine is called an overlocker. What we need to remember on this machine is it has 4 threads, 1, 2, 3, 4. And these threads are very, they like it a certain way. So if you don't put this up, the threads might get a bit angry and decide to unthread your overlocking. So when you set this up, just make sure your threads are nice and straight, not tangled. Make sure you've got this bar up. And then we are good to go. We also need to remember, we need to make sure that there's a tail on the end of the sewing machine, and it needs to come all the way to this back corner to make sure that it's going to work all right. So when we're ready to overlock, we need to remember that this part here, that's a blade, and that will cut the edge of your fabric and give you a nice neat edge. When we sew our open seam, we're just going to sew the edge of the fabric here just to cut off this fraying, lock it in and make it nice and neat. So we start off, we position our fabric into the sewing machine, into the overlocker. We have to follow this line here if we don't want to cut too much of the fabric off. Our machine is turned on. And just make sure as you are overlocking that nothing is caught underneath, because it will cut off and ruin your work. So once you've gone through your fabric, you have to keep going all the way so that the tail is all the way to the back corner. And then we have to make sure that we cut it at the back corner here, because we don't want these threads to go inside of the machine and have to rethread the overlocker. Next we have to do our other side. All the way to the corner and cut our threads. Next step, we go back to the iron and press that sucker out. Excitingly, our very last step is to press our open seam open one more time, just to get that finish beautiful. And there you have it, an open seam stitch sampler completed.